Yeah, that's true.
Everyone's attention is being pulled so many different directions right now.
Right. It's hard to stay focused.
Yeah, it's gonna be. I just want it to be over with, buddy.
Because it's sort of midterm time for everybody, right?
Yeah, which is it's rough when people feel that their entire existence is dependent on what happens on Tuesday,
Right. For
which is
sure.
always kind of it, buddy.
I know, right? Yeah, I'm very curious to see what's going to happen.
Well, we did our part, hopefully. Hopefully you did, and we all did, and that's all we can do at this point. And just holding on to it is causing so much distress for me that I realized that I did my part, and it
What
can't
else can
really
you
do
do at
anything
this point, you
for
know?
me. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
That's what
You just sit there and,
the ancient Stoic philosophers had this concept of the dichotomy of control, right? Where it's somehow enlightening to really realize the difference between the things you actually have control over, and be proactive in those areas, and then also know that sometimes there's nothing you can do, and
yeah, it
to
causes,
just accept that. It's difficult,
causes
but
more damage than dwell on it, and to just sit there.
yeah, exactly, yeah. It's a whole issue with anxiety too, right? Good anxiety, it makes you do stuff. It makes you get off your butt and get stuff done, right? But there's also the kind of anxiety that cripples people, that actually, even though maybe it's about something real and it's not just in their head, but it can end up crippling you, and actually not allowing you to flourish and help the world, because you're so worried about the world to begin with. But if you have a lot of
It's also
anxiety
so
about it.
rough that every time you turn on a computer, a TV, a radio, no matter what your media choice it is, that this is all you're inundated with is this.
Absolutely,
And
right.
there's no feel good stories to take your mind off it. We
Right.
had the Dodgers the World Series. That was great for me because it was like, hey, something to be
Something
excited about,
good.
something different. And
Right.
as trivial as it is, we need those things.
There's something for your mind to also be happy about, exactly.
Right,
If it's just
right.
a constant parade of misery.
The feeling of impending doom.
Right. Okay, well, we got 4 people in here now. Welcome Destiny and Marlo as well. And Kyle. Yeah, let's get started. We talked about identity theory last time. Right? And identity theory is a very straightforward. Well, I mean, it can get complex when you really start digging into it and starting to ask difficult questions. Yes, Marlo, thank you. I am recording. Always good to ask. um, Identity theory itself, the theory is pretty straightforward. It's just the idea that the mind, this thing that we've been talking about, the mind, the way that Descartes talked about the mind as whatever it is that is able to have sensations and think thoughts, remember things, all that stuff, all those mental phenomena that we associate with, whatever it is that the mind is. We think it's whatever it is that can do those things. Descartes thought it was some sort of immaterial substance that we can't actually verify. The identity theorists said, "Well, look, we've been doing all this brain science. The mind just is the brain. It's the brain that is capable of doing all these things that you're talking about." Right? It's the brain that is able to process visual information. It's the brain that is able to allow you to look back on your life, right? To think about memories that you had. It's your brain that allows you to have an imagination. It's your brain that allows you to do math. It's your brain. Right? Your brain is the mind. That's what it is. And this is, just it's a good case, right? You can make a pretty good case for this especially if you're aware of brain science, if you understand the way in which the brain has, to a certain extent anyway, different compartments that are responsible for different areas, right? Kant seemed to have been right in that sense, is that your mind, Kant wasn't talking about the brain, but when we think about the brain, there's a temporal lobe, right? There's a whole part of your brain that is responsible for organizing your experience in a way that makes sense, where one thing happens after the next thing. You see things in terms of cause and effect, before or after, right? Those Kantian glasses that you can't take off. Yeah, that's actually part of your brain. Your brain structure is what allows you to have this kind of experience. And if you mess with any of those structures, you mess with your experience, right? So brain damage is going to involve mental damage, right? It's going to affect your mental capacities. Any kinds of drugs that target specific areas in the brain will also completely change your conscious experience of the world, right? And it can actually mess with the way in which your brain ordinarily processes the world, like so that, for example, the temporal lobe, if you're on acid or something like that, it might really mess with that, and you no longer have this sort of smooth, well understandable, intelligible framework of cause and effect, with time appearing to be a smooth sort of thing that goes along at an even pace. You take the right kind of drugs or have the right kind of brain damage, and all of that experience gets completely changed around and jumbled. Well, it seems as though you're affecting whatever it is that allows you to have experience, whatever it is that allows you to have thoughts and have experiences and all that. It seems as though that must be the brain then, right? So that's the idea that the identity theorists had. And to a large extent, I don't think we've entirely moved away from that basic insight, right? It's just that what we looked at last time, it's sort of a technical problem, I think. The technical problem is this. If, say, a pain is just a brain state, right? So a pain is just a particular kind of brain state. Well, then what if we see another kind of creature or being who seems to be in pain, but it does not have the corresponding brain state? Then you'd either have to say one of two things. That creature doesn't really feel pain, or the brain state is not the criteria of what a pain is. A brain state does not actually tell you that a creature is in pain, right? Because again, imagine two creatures both in pain, but both having different types of brains. If a strict mind-brain identity theory is correct, they could not both have pain, right? Because whatever that specific pain is, it would have to be identical with some specific brain state. But we've already postulated, or we've already assumed, or we can actually just notice in real life, different kinds of creatures have different kinds of brain. And some creatures might not even have a central processing unit like that. We could imagine an alien with a vastly different kind of makeup, who might still, if we see them step on a tack or a piece of Lego and they engage in the kind of behavior that we do, it's quite reasonable to say, oh, they're just a living, breathing creature like me who can feel pain. But if that pain that you have is identical with some sort of specific brain state, then you can't call that pain, right? So that's the problem. It's kind of a technical problem, right? That problem does not mean that it isn't your brain that's responsible in your case. It just means that however we define pain, or any other mental state for that matter, we can't necessarily define it in terms of one specific brain state, because of this multiple realizability idea, right? That different kinds of critters could give rise to different kinds of mental states, but the underlying hardware is totally different, right? So me and the alien might both be able to feel pain, even though the alien doesn't have a brain state, right? Or me and the octopus might both have memories. I don't know, right? They might be able to, but the way in which that works in an octopus is different than it is in a human being. So the idea is there's something that we're sharing, a pain, memory, the capacity for any of these things. We have that in common. We don't have a brain state in common. So it cannot be the brain then that's actually how we define the thing, right? It's almost as though the underlying hardware is sort of accidental. So that was the problem for identity theory, and that's where functionalism steps in. So functionalism just defines it in a slightly different way, in such a way that we can still, by the way, talk about the brain, right? So a modern day neuroscientist or a psychologist, if they're at least if they're at all more scientifically inclined, they're still going to be talking about the brain and all the things that the brain can do. It's just that we cannot define it so rigidly the way the mind brain identity theorists did. It's got to be a little bit more open ended than that, because again, we can expect mental states without corresponding brain states, at least without the kind of brain states that we have. So if the mental states are possible without having those exact type of brain states, then it cannot be identical to those brain states, right? It's the same kind of thing as a mouse trap, right? If I tell you what a mouse trap is and I say, oh well, it's one of those little wooden things with a latch on it, and you put a piece of cheese on it, and when the mouse comes it smacks it like that. That's the mouse trap. You'd say, well, no, that's a type of mouse trap, right? But you can make a mouse trap in different ways, and you'd still have a mouse trap. So you can't say it's specifically that thing, right? There are different ways to make a mouse trap. What they all have in common, that's what defines a mouse trap. It's not the underlying material that you happen to use, right? So that's what the functionalist is going to say. Okay. I just got to adjust the window for the people who are watching this later, because this is one of those prezzies that I can't control with my phone, so I have to go to the actual screen, then I can't see you guys anymore. But okay, so we might as well talk a little bit about Alan Turing here. People know about Alan Turing. I think a lot of people have at least heard of him. That movie came out just a little bit ago. What was it called? Does anyone remember what it was called? I don't remember. Anyway, there's a whole movie about Alan Turing, and because his life is very interesting, right? This polymath, typical. Alan Turing could have been one of those 17th or 18th century philosophers who sort of had a finger in every pie, as it were, right? He's all over the place. He does math, he does logic, crypto analysis, he does philosophy. He worked as a code breaker during World War II. So Hitler had these very elaborate codes, these code machines that were constantly changing the parameters, so they're very difficult to break. But Alan Turing figured out a way to break that code, and he was able to. They were able to intercept all sorts of attacks and things like that because this guy was doing this work. So he helped win the war basically, because there were some crucial battles and crucial moves that the Germans, if we had not known about it, it could have affected the outcome in very bad ways. So, it provided an incredible service and used his brilliant mind towards this end. Right, very cool. Very unfortunate. Then later on. This is in England. This is at a time when it is actually illegal still to be gay, right? Alan Turing was found hanging out with a guy. As you now, nobody bats an eye at that. That's fine, right? But at the time, that was still illegal. So he got arrested for it, the poor guy, after giving his brilliant mind to save perhaps millions of people, who knows. He was arrested for just being himself. And he was given the option of jail time or probation, but the terms of probation were chemical castration. Right? So he had to be chemically castrated. That was part of his probation. Shortly after all this whole humiliating affair, he got stripped of all his honors. He wasn't able to go, he didn't have all his government clearance anymore because of this, right? He was a top tier government worker who helped save who helped win the war. Now all his clearances are gone, and he feels disgraced. And shortly after, they find his dead body alongside an apple with a bite out of it. Was never tested for poison. People speculate that it may have been laced with arsenic or something like that. Acquaintances of Alan Turing also mentioned that one of his favorite movies was Snow White. So there's a weird kind of imagery going on there. We don't know if it's a coincidence, but it's an interesting one regardless. So anyway, his whole life is very interesting. It's very unfortunate what happened. Why we're talking about him here is because he developed this idea of a Turing machine, which eventually just became computers, right? What you're doing right now. So not only did he help win World War II, he's also the reason that you have a computer or any kind of device in front of you right now. So it just started out with just an idea. Basically, he's a logic person. Now, if you take my critical thinking class, we'll do logic. Logic is basically the language of computers, right? So it's basically the sort of if P then Q, P therefore Q, that sort of a thing, right? So computer language is Boolean. It doesn't matter what that is, but it's a type of logic. Logic also was developed by, as you remember, philosophers, right? Aristotle was the first one to really formalize logic. Throughout the medieval period, a lot of people were still working on logic. And then closer to the modern period, you have people like Gottlob Frege, who really synthesized all the previous logic into something very, very powerful. And it's because of that kind of work that you then have people taking that logic and applying it in a very practical way to these machines. Because basically what you can do is you can, even before you build a machine, you could conceptualize a machine. And you can basically just define all the things that that machine will do based on the input that it gets, right? So if it gets this kind of input, then this is what happens, and that puts the machine in this kind of state. And when the machine is in this state and it gets this input, then it gets this output, and then perhaps it's in a different state. So, you can kind of imagine just a series of if-then statements to basically help you compute something. For example, you could write the logic of of doing math, right? So that's what a calculator is. It's basically, it has a little logical language inside of that system that allows it to go through all these steps to then give you the end results, right? So when you type in 1 + 1 = and it gives you the results, that's what it's doing. It's a little Turing machine that's taking those inputs, and then there's a whole bunch of rules inside of it that tells the machine how to take those inputs and then give it into an output. So Alan Turing came up with this concept, a Turing machine basically, and then people developed that into real machines, right? So people made real Turing machines, and those were the earliest forms of computers. It's basically just a flow chart of if-then statements, basically depending on what kind of input you get, what state the machine is in, then what kind of output does it get. Right. And so people were looking at this and were seeing that, well, so you could have machines do all these things that usually only humans can do, right? It used to be for someone like Descartes, for example, the mind is so different from the everyday physical world because you can do things like intuit basic truths like 2 + 2 = 4, right? You can have access to this realm of mathematical forms, or think back to Plato or someone like that, right? You're somehow magically almost reaching towards these ineffable truths. Well, they're effable because they're sayable. So 2 + 2 = 4 is not an ineffable truth, but it's this sort of transcendent truth. That's at least the way we thought about it. So we thought a mind must be really, really kind of special because no animal or anything like that could do anything like that. But now we're seeing these Turing machines can actually take over a lot of the jobs that previously only we could. So a calculator is a very good example of that, right? If you had thought about one of the mental capacities that we have as human beings, one of these things that tells us that we have a mind, doing math is one of them, right? This would have been one of Descartes' essential features of a thinking being, right? Is you can do things like calculate sums. That's what makes you a person with a mind rather than just a physical being, a physical object. No, you have a mind because you can think about these mathematical truths. But now you have a calculator. It does not involve any kind of immaterial mind. It does not involve grasping some sort of innate idea. It doesn't involve grasping anything in the Platonic realm. It's just this little thing that follows a bunch of rules, and then it tells you the right answer. It can do math, right? And it can do it much better than we can. So what else can machines do, right? If a machine can do this what we always thought was this essentially mental process of figuring out a sum in mathematics, now a machine can do it. Well, then there's all sorts of tasks that we thought required human intelligence, but perhaps no. Perhaps all of the things that we as human beings are able to do with our minds, perhaps these can all be modeled in a Turing machine, in a computer. Right? A computer computes things. Right? That's why it's called a computer. Right? So maybe we are just advanced Turing machines. Right? Maybe it's just a bunch of rules in our head that are being followed. So when we get an input, depending on what kind of state we're in right now, then you get an output. Right? Maybe humans are just advanced Turing machines. Right? So this is where the idea of a Turing test comes from. Right? This idea that you could if we wanted to test whether or not a machine could have human intelligence, right? Specifically about intelligence, okay? So don't get that confused with other concepts like consciousness or self-awareness. We're not necessarily asking about that. The Turing test is about measuring intelligence. And the idea is that if you can have a conversation, right, conversation with a Turing machine, where you don't know if there's a real human on the other end or just a computer, and you're able to have a conversation, and you cannot figure out that they're not a human, if you can't figure out that it's a machine, then it's passed the test. It means that machine is just as intelligent as a human being, right? Okay, so this is setting us up for functionalism because this basically describes functionalism, right? The idea of a Turing machine, or basically, let's just call it what it is now, a computer, right? So you see the progression, right? We start with pure logic. The logicians and philosophers have been working on that for millennia. It gets to a crucial point where it's working really well. Then you get people like Alan Turing taking that and saying, we could take that mental technology, we could take this intellectual technology, and implement it in a machine to do all these cool tasks. And then people did that, right? And those first Turing machines are basically, it's applied logic, but it's also the first computer. So now we have computers, and they're just all around us. How do they work? Well, they work according to functionalism, right? Computers work by taking inputs and then providing an output. And where the output that it provides depends on the internal rules and internal states of the machine. Just like for a calculator or for a computer or a cell phone, whatever it is, it's going to be the same thing. So here's a simple Turing machine, right? So this is like a vending machine. I didn't actually build this. That's what makes this a virtual machine, right? That's where we start. We just start with, well, what if there were a machine that we could program all these rules into it? All right, so this is a simple Turing machine that gives you $1 Coke, and it'll give you change if you give anything over $1. It only takes dollars and quarters, right? I made this machine myself, this virtual machine. It only takes dollars or quarters. But you notice that, for example, if you let's say gave it 3 quarters, right? First quarter you'd go into state 1. So if you're in state 1 is just where it is by default. So if it's in state 1 and you give it a quarter, then it's going to go to state 2. If it's in state 2 and you give it a quarter, then it's going to go to state 3. Now imagine that I've put in another quarter. I put in 3 quarters so far. Now I'm in state 4. If I give another quarter, it'll give me my Coke, right? Because I gave it 4 quarters. That's right. So it would give me a Coke, and then it would go back to the default state 1, right? That would be fine. I could give it 4 quarters and I'd get my Coke. Perfect, right? What if I put 3 quarters in and I realize suddenly, wait a minute, I need those quarters for my laundry, right? I better stick $1 in now, right? So I've given it 75 cents. Now it's in state 3. And now what if we give it $1 as an input? Well, then it'll know to give me the Coke. Right, so sorry, I'd put 2 quarters in at this point, right? Yeah, I'd put 2 quarters in when I'm at state 3. Then it'll give the Coke and give me my 2 quarters back and change back to state 1. Okay, so if you don't follow that, all of that, that's fine. The basic idea is just this is a working. This would be a Coke machine that will give you a Coke if you give it $1. As long as you're feeding it dollars or quarters. If you give it not enough, it will not give you a Coke. If you give it too much, it'll give you the correct change back. Right? You see that? So notice that it's not just the inputs that determine the outputs. It also depends on the internal state of the machine, right? It'll give you a different output if it's in state 2 than in state 4, right? If you're in state 4 and you give it a quarter, it'll finally give you that Coke. If it's in state 2 and you give it that quarter, it's not going to give you the Coke yet. Do you see how that works? Well, it's a simple Turing machine, right? Inputs and outputs and some sort of internal set of rules that tells it how to do that. And included in that is what state the machine itself is in at that point in time, right? Right, so just kind of get used to seeing things in this way. Seeing these functional items anyway, items that have a specific function to them or a set of functions. You can think of it as an input delivering an output. Right? This is very much like what we saw in behaviorism, except behaviorism just did not want to talk about the insides at all. Right? Functionalism is a little better about that. Remember the analogy we had? The behaviorists are like people that cannot get inside the phone. So all they can really study is how do these programs work? How do these apps work in terms of what input I get and then what output I get? What input I give and then what output I give. We could map all those, but then we still would not really know how it worked on the inside. Right? So the functionalist wants to say, well, how does this actually work in human beings? Right? How do our brains actually take the input from the environment into an output in our behavior? So functionalism is primarily a physicalist theory of mind, though it does not have to be. Right? So this is something that's kind of tricky. Functionalism is usually equated to some sort of physicalism, okay? Because it's hard to deny the power of the brain, right, when it comes to the mind. At least for people who have spent a lot of time on this issue and who've looked at the science of it, it's hard to really motivate this idea of an immaterial mind anymore, because it seems too obvious that the brain is doing all this stuff, right? So functionalism is usually physicalist. All these people are physicalists, right? Again, a physicalist is just someone that thinks, here's the natural world all around us, made of physical stuff. All this stuff is made of atoms. All the phenomena that we see in the world, they're just emergent phenomena based on these different levels of complexity that we've looked at, right? But technically, you could be a dualist and be a functionalist, right? You could say that the machine that is processing all this input and giving the outputs is actually your mind, the immaterial mind, right? So it could be an immaterial machine that's doing all this, theoretically. Again, most people do not combine most people do not combine functionalism with non-physicalism, but it is a logical possibility, just something to bring up. So, gained prominence in the 60s, and it's really just a natural development of identity theory. You know, it's again, I think these are mostly people that are agreeing that for human beings, it's our brains that are allowing for this possibility of these mental states. It's just that they're not going to say that we can equate the mental states to the brain states, because different types of physical systems might be able to instantiate those mental states, right? And this is still a going theory today, both in philosophy. Functionalism is still very popular, and in the brain sciences and psychology. This is the basic paradigm. Oh, you thought it started? Yeah, it never has, but I've done that before, where I suddenly think I just have the wrong. Yeah, that's happened to me too. I don't know what caused that to happen, right? If I had to venture a guess, I think it's something that happened in the brain. Okay, I don't think it's something that happened in your immaterial soul. It's a little brain hiccup. So to explain this a little bit more, let me explain this idea: compositional identity versus functional identity. Now, this is going to. I love it when philosophy is like this. When you go through all these different eras and different times and different concepts and different problems, but you find the same basic concepts repeated a lot of times. Compositional versus functional identity is basically just talking about form and matter again. Remember form and matter from Aristotle? It's basically the same thing. Okay. Compositional identity, yeah, is when a thing is defined by what it's made of. Right? What makes a diamond rather than an amethyst? Well, it's made of solid carbon. Right? Now, this is kind of a weird example because it does have to have a specific kind of structure, but the basic idea is that a diamond is what it is because of its what it's made of. And if that's not a good example, then what about water? What makes water water, right? What makes water water rather than liquid nitrogen, right? Well, it's made of different types of molecules than liquid nitrogen, right? It's made of this molecule that's two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom, right? That's what makes water water because of what it's made of. And we can also, whenever you point out the difference between two types of tables and the wood they're made of, you are appealing to compositional identity, right? What's the difference here between a pine table and an oak table? What makes one a pine table and the other one an oak table? Well, it's right there in the name. It's what it's made of. This one's made of pine, this one's made of oak. It's what they're composed of. You get that compositional identity? You could probably think of other examples too. There's lots of things that we point out in the world that we are able to identify on the basis of what it's made of. Okay? So that's one way. Just a way to define things or to specify things or to categorize things, right? But we can also talk about the functional identity of something. Right? So now let's look at our mousetrap example again, right? What makes a mousetrap a mousetrap? Yes, you can define something by what it isn't made of, right? Then we're headed into postmodern areas where you can define something by what's that old? I think that guy Slavoj Žižek has this. He's a contemporary philosopher. Has this funny example of I'd like a coffee with no cream, please, said to the waiter, and the waiter says, "Sorry, we're all out of cream. I can only give you coffee with no milk." That's a thinker, but that's that kind of a thing. Well, what makes a mousetrap a mousetrap? It's not really what it's made of, right? I mean, it matters to a certain extent. Right? You probably can't make a mousetrap out of liquid water, right? Or just that, right? Or a single blade of grass, right? But on the whole, it doesn't really matter what you make it out of as long as it can do the job, right? As long as it gets the job done, that's what matters. You don't have to make a mousetrap like this. And nowadays, if you buy a mousetrap, you're probably not going to get anything like that. You'll probably get one of those little boxes that they go into and kills them humanely or traps them or something like that, right? What makes it a mousetrap is not what it's made of, but what it does, right? What its function is, right? It's not to say that it doesn't matter at all what it's made of, right? That's what I'm saying is, as long as it's got the functionality, right? As long as the materials allow for that functionality to arise, allow for it to emerge, right? Then you've got a mousetrap. Or let's say a heart, right? What makes it a heart rather than a liver? Well, it's not so much the materials that it's made of. It's much more about its function in the organism. You know, and that's why when you get an artificial heart, or perhaps some part of your heart got replaced by something synthetic, we still call it a heart because it performs that basic function. Even though now, if it's artificial, it's not made at all of the same kind of stuff that our regular heart is made of, but it performs that function. So we still get to call it a heart. Sure, we'll call it an artificial heart, but it's still a heart. Or again, if that's too extreme, imagine that just some small part of your heart was replaced by synthetic material. Would you say that because part of your heart is now made of something different, that it's no longer a heart? No, of course not. Your heart is still functioning. That's what makes it a heart. Right? If we bring back our table here, right? If we're not distinguishing between different tables with different types of wood, but rather distinguishing between a table and a chair, it's not at all about what they're made of, right? The difference between a table and a chair is not the materials. The difference between a table and a chair is its overall form and function, right? What purpose does it serve? That's what defines the difference between a table and a chair. You know, you see the difference? So we have these two different ways of identifying something, by what it's made of or by what its function is. Well, functionalism says that's how we should think of mental states. We should think of mental states in terms of their function. Right? What is it that they do? What does pain do for the organism? What does remembering do for the organism? Right? What does imagination allow a human being to do? Right? It's the functionalities of mental states that is important. It's not what they're made of. Right? And it's almost as though the mind-brain identity theorist, this is maybe simplifying it a little too much, but it's a little bit like they're saying that mental states, they're defined of what they're composed of. Right? That they're these brain states. They're human brain states. Just like water is made out of these particular H2O molecules. In the same way, the identity theorist says mind states are made of brain states. Right? Functionalist says, no, it's not like that. It's the functional roles that mental states play. That's what's important. Just like a table is defined by its functional role. Right? So you wouldn't define a table as a structure that's made out of pine wood, right? Or even a structure made of wood. Right? That's just not the right way to define it. Yes, you could build a table with wood, but that's just one way to do it. What makes it a table is its functionality. The same thing is true of our minds and of our mental states. Yeah, you could get mental states with a brain, right? That could be the underlying hardware that you're using. Just like you could make a table out of pine, but you don't gotta, right? You could make a table out of metal or ice, for that matter, if you wanted to, right? And it's the same is true of minds or mental states, according to the functionalists. It doesn't have to be brain states as long as it can perform the same type of function. Right? So long as your heart can pump blood, it's a heart. So long as your mind allows you to feel feelings and to think thoughts and to have pains and memories, then it's a mind. But those things are all functions. They're functionalities. Those things don't necessarily have anything to do with the underlying hardware, the underlying machinery. Yeah. So you could be a functionalist who's very optimistic about this, right? You could be a functionalist that says, "Aha, see, that means we could make minds in all sorts of other places. We could just build a computer that could be a mind. Or a mind could be anything as long as it has those functional roles." And they could be very optimistic about the same way that you could build a table out of all sorts of different materials. Maybe you could make a mind out of all sorts of different materials. You could be a very optimistic functionalist in that way. Or you could be a functionalist who says, "Yeah, I'm sorry, it is, mental states should be defined as functions, but it's unlikely that we can get that kind of functionality on anything but a human brain," right? You might be very skeptical about the ability of any other kind of machinery to do the job. Right? There might be something very special about the biology and just the basic plumbing of the human brain that makes it that no, actually, a computer maybe cannot do that. It needs more. It's just the way that brains are engineered. It cannot be. It just can't be. It can't be copied onto a computer program, for example. Maybe it's just not possible, right? So you could be a functionalist and have the basic idea there that mental states are defined by their function, not what is allowing them to exist, right? But you could do that two ways. You could be someone who's very, very optimistic that therefore artificial intelligence is just around the corner, right? Or you could say, well, functionalism is right, but unfortunately, there's only so many ways that you can make mental states, right? Yeah. So what's nice is, of course, functionalism wants to look behind wants to look behind the enclosure, right? Wants to look inside the black box. You see, the functionalists are a lot like the behaviorists because they're tracking the inputs and the outputs, right? But the functionalists, because they can, they're now relying on more cutting edge science that allows us to actually look inside the brain, that we don't just have to map the inputs to the outputs, but we can actually look inside and see how these brain states are translating inputs to outputs, see how the functionality actually works. Right? Look inside the cell phone, right, to see how the hardware actually makes this possible. Yeah, so it's going beyond behaviorism in that way, in a good way, right? Do you have an example? Uh, Other inaccessible. So you mean like something like it could apply to the mind if the mind is like math? Well, yeah. I mean, we do talk about functions in math, right? So yes, it is taking that same basic model. It's again, it's given to us by logic, right? Logic works that way. It's also inputs and outputs, and then by extension, math as well. So we talk about mathematical or logical functions. What do mathematical or logical functions do? They take inputs and give us outputs. But non-physical stuff, yeah, well, it's because it's so hard to conceive of, right? This is why dualism is not popular with people who've thought about this a lot. Now, there are exceptions to that, okay? But for the most part, when you really get down to, well, what do you mean by this non-physical stuff? It gets to be very hard to actually specify what you're talking about. But yeah, at the very least, what I said earlier applies that you could be a functionalist, but you just think that the underlying hardware is an immaterial soul. Right? Which for Descartes, remember, it's still a substance, it's still a something. It's just not extended, right? Very hard to conceive of it, but okay. Conceivably, you could imagine, suppose there were an immaterial soul or some actual stuff, perhaps that has that functionality of being able to think, right? So it's almost as though, take your pick. Are you a dualist or a physicalist? Either way, you should probably be a functionalist because either way, it's all about the functionality of the mental states. That's what defines them. You know, oh yeah, the past. Yeah, maybe if we think of the past as something non-physical. Well, of course, that'll depend on which theory of time you look at, right? Because on one theory of time, each time slice is completely physical. It's just that's where that time slice is, and that's where this one is. And just because we don't happen to be in that one anymore does not make that one not real, right? It just makes our relationship to it a little complicated. But so maybe the past, I'm not sure. It would be any kind of machine, right? Any kind of thing that can do something. Um, if it's immaterial and it can do something, then it's a functional kind of a thing. Yeah. Well, functionalism ends up applying. Once you understand the idea, you see it everywhere. Inputs and outputs according to a list of rules. Yeah. It's math already, right? It's logic already, and then you apply it into the real world, and you get things like computers, right? And then the functionalist says it's not just computers and calculators. It's not just mousetraps, right? It's not just tables. Human beings are like this as well, right? We are these machines with these basic functions that are able to translate inputs into outputs in very, very complex ways, of course, but computers are very complex as well, right? You know. Okay. And functionalism, right? This is basically its main edge over identity theory, right, is that it allows for multiple realizability. It's the idea that we could see, at least intuitively, that other animals can be in pain, right? Now, remember, this is something that Descartes denied, because Descartes did not think that animals had an immaterial soul attached to them. So animals are simply these machines, but there's no actual inner state of pain the way that we think of it, right? This ouchy feeling that we don't like, right? That we base moral claims on, right? So, for example, we think it is wrong to just go up to a random person and punch them hard in the face, right? It's wrong because it causes suffering. It causes this suffering, and we think suffering is wrong to inflict on people who don't deserve it, right? And we are appealing to these mental states, right? Don't we do the same thing for animals, right? Well, many people are concerned about animal welfare, and even if you're not worried about eating meat or things like that, say you have a dog and you step on their toe and the dog goes, "Arr!" What are you going to assume? That it's just sort of a simulation, like the bark doesn't really mean anything? Or is it the dog really got hurt, right? On functionalism, it makes sense to say that the dog really got hurt because look at its behavior. It's just like us. It got this input of some sort of, nerve damage or nerve pressure, and then it goes into the processing chamber, the brain, right? And then this very familiar output, a cry of pain comes out. Now, my brain states when I get hurt and the brain state of the dog might be totally different. What matters is that we see the same overall story, the same kind of pattern. We see the inputs of being stepped on, and then we see the output of crying out in pain, and we understand how this works, right? It's the same functionality, basically, that we see. And if it was just all about the brain states, then we wouldn't be able to call that a pain. Right? But we recognize it as a pain, not because of the brain state, which we ordinarily don't even have access to anyway, right? When you judge that a dog is in pain, it's not because you check their brain state. Right? It's rather because you see what kind of role it plays in the organism's behavior, right? You can see how pain is the thing that translates that input to some sort of behavior. That evolutionarily speaking, right, to have that just be an automatic response, it means that other creatures who are close to you might tend to you and see if you're okay. Right? There's all sorts of ways to tell an evolutionary story about that. But it's the same. It's the idea is that a basic functionality has arisen in different types of creatures with different types of brains and nervous systems, and we're able to say that they're the same, not because of what they're made of, not because of the underlying hardware, but because of the similar function that it serves in the organism. Okay? So multiple realizability means multiple physical systems can instantiate the same type of mental phenomena. Okay? So you can have an octopus brain and a human brain that can both feel pain. Right? And perhaps you could have a human brain and a computer hard drive able to realize certain mental functions. At the very least, things like adding or subtracting numbers, right? A machine could do that. So it can do the same mental process that we can. And theoretically, it can do any of the things that our brains can do. If our brains are just taking inputs and translating them into outputs according to a list of rules, basically, then we could simply duplicate that. We could get those rules implemented in a system and have it be able to do all the same things that we can. So, you'd probably have to put this program into some sort of avatar, right? Some sort of robot body, like think of Westworld or something like that. As long as that computer is doing all the same kind of processing as your brain does, then we would have to say that that's an intelligent thinking thing. It has a mind, right? So let me say that again, right? You have all sorts of things that you're able to do. You're able to take inputs and then translate that into an output. If you have a machine that can do all those same things, according to functionalism, it would have a mind just as much as you do. Because it can have all those functionalities. It can do the same things as you do. Right? So it's the same way as if a mouse trap can trap a mouse, it's a mouse trap. It doesn't matter if it's different from the typical mouse trap. Right? If a computer can do all the same things that a brain can do, then the computer has mental states. Just like the brain has mental states because it has those functionalities. Oh yeah, I need to put these in a different place. I mean, I already talked about this, right? The basic idea is that the behaviorist says this is a model. All we can really study is the inputs and the outputs. The functionalist says, hey, well, look, we can actually now check inside the brain and see what's happening, right? We can check to see that there's all sorts of stuff going on. There's all these rules going on inside the brain. And we can actually track those and learn about how the brain does it in this systematic way. Let's see. Oh, right, because you sort of get higher and higher intelligence as you go along. Yeah. Although I'm trying to think about that because it is quite a bit different than just natural evolution occurring, right? When we actually create something even more intelligent, it's sort of outside of the realm of just regular natural selection, right? So it's a kind of a weird wrinkle to it. But it does sort of fit this pattern, right? That higher levels of complexity can emerge over time. Right? And those higher levels of complexity are associated with higher levels of intelligence or consciousness in some cases when it comes to certain types of organism. Yeah. Right, so behaviorism just says, well, we can't get inside that black box. The functionalist says, well, actually, now we can. Right? Now we can't maybe access those inner feelings, right? It's still impossible for the scientists to literally feel the pain that you feel, but the scientists can study the inputs, what is happening inside your brain, and then the output and the way that these all relate together. Right? And this functionalist approach is you'll find this in many areas of science. I already talked about this, right? That of course you find it in math and in logic, but you find it in biology in general, right? So when you study a single-celled amoeba or something like that, you're going to learn about it on a very functionalist model. You're going to learn about the way it interacts with its environment, right? And the way that it interacts with its environment depends on the kind of internal structure that it has. That's a functionalist analysis of a single-celled amoeba. We're using the same kind of analysis for a human being here. So mental states, you can think of them as functional states, right, rather than brain states, because again, it's not so much about the brain, right? An analogy I could give is if I had my phone, I don't have my phone right now, but on my phone I've got my little Facebook app, right? Does anyone else have a Facebook app? You can also go on a different kind of screen, right? You can go on your laptop or your iPad, and you can also access that Facebook app. Right? What defines that as a Facebook app? What makes that the Facebook app? Is it the particular hardware on your phone, or the particular hardware on your iPad? Well, no, it can't be, can it? Because you can access a Facebook app here, or there, or there. Right? Facebook apps are multiply realizable, right? What defines the Facebook app is what it allows you to do. You can sign into it and see what people wrote and post your pictures, right? Get gratification and dopamine hits from the little blue notification or the red notifications that tell you somebody liked your picture or something. It's the functionality that I'm looking for. It doesn't matter which particular piece of hardware that functionality is implemented on. It's the same thing is true for mental states. It's their functionality. It's the fact that they act as these states, as these functional states that translate input to behavior. Okay? So, it's a lot of it is about determining the causal role that a mental state plays. Our mental states are causally related to an output, right, from the environment, or, of course, other mental states as well. This gets to be a pretty complex picture. Right, you noticed earlier when we looked at the Coke dispenser. It's pretty simple, but you saw, right, that you could give it the same input, a quarter, but it'll give you a different output depending on the internal state. Right? You see how it's kind of complex, right? So sometimes people think, well, if human beings were really like that, they'd be like robots and we'd all act the same. Well, no, we would not, because we're always in different states from one another when we're given the same inputs. Right? You're a different person than I am, your wiring is slightly different, so there's always going to be a slightly different internal state. What can also happen is some sort of internal occurrence provides a kind of an input, right? So, for example, let's look at a pretty regular scenario and look at it as a functionalist, right? So, for example, the dog got stepped on, right? Or I pinched myself, right? And I feel pain, and then there's some sort of behavior. How do we analyze that? Well, we get the input identified, right? Some sort of body tissue damage or pressure, some sort of pain behavior, right? Ow, or like that, right? There's the pain behavior. Internally, though, there's also things going on, right? Like, I want to get rid of the pain, right? That's an input as well, right? Because the pain itself made me feel in my internal states a desire to get rid of it, right? That's a mental state as well. So now I've got this internal mental state that was caused by the external thing, but that internal mental state will then make me think about ways to get rid of the pain. And this all happens very quickly, of course. I'm not conscious of all this stuff, but my brain is doing all this stuff very quickly, right? So it's produced this internal state, but that internal state leads to another internal state, right? And it's not just very quickly from the input right to the behavior. Right? All sorts of stuff is happening in here, right? We know that with computers, and that's for sure true with human beings as well. So we're giving this a kind of a simple picture, but the reality of it is very complicated. But it's still basically this idea of a series of inputs, first from the environment, but also internal inputs, right? It just depends on what mental states you're in and what other things are happening inside your mind that then lead to some sort of behavior, right? So all those internal mental states that were caused by the environmental input eventually lead to certain kinds of behaviors, right? Like going like this, right? Rubbing it will lead to some kind of behavior. So that would be a functionalist analysis of a mental state, right? You identify that mental state and its relationship to other mental states, and then its relationship to an input and to an output. So the upshot of this is very much that, according to functionalism, right, brains are basically like computers. Readjusting my window here. Right, so we've used this analogy a few times already, right? We talk about computers on two different levels, right? We can talk about the hardware, and we can talk about the software. Is everyone familiar with that distinction? So let's focus just on computers for a second. Computers are, it's physicalism, right? Nobody's a dualist about computers, right? Do computers have an immaterial soul? No, right? It's just a bunch of hardware, right? I mean, we know this, right? Computers, wonderful as they are, it boils down to a handful of chemicals, right? I could show you where from nature all the parts of your computer were taken, right? There are these different parts of nature that we took and smelted down to various components. They're all just itty little bits of pieces, right? And it's all made of atoms, right? Here you would accept a reductionist account, right? For your computer, you realize, yes, your computer is made out of a bunch of molecules, and those molecules are all made of atoms. So your computer is just a very complex configuration of atoms. I assume you accept that. But of course, we can talk about the hardware at that very low level, right? Just the physical components, just like we can do with atoms. We can talk about the atoms at this level. But then, of course, if you combine atoms in various ways, you get molecules. You take those molecules, you get cells, right? And you get cells, you suddenly have these emergent phenomena. Now, that's different from what the atoms are doing, but it's a real phenomena, right? So things like life, for example, happens over here. What is life? It's a kind of functionality that arises at higher levels of complexity. What's so complex? Well, just the configuration of atoms, and then the configuration of molecules, right? So, life then, you could say, is like software. It's the same kind of thing. We're talking about it at this higher level, when really we're just talking about atoms, but it's too hard to talk about life at that level. We can't focus in on the patterns in the correct way. We have to zoom out and see an actual organism in order to see life. Right? That organism is made of nothing but atoms, but we have to zoom out to see life, right? So computers are the same kind of thing. We can talk about the software as though it's different from the hardware, but really it's not, right? Software doesn't have its own disembodied existence. Software is just the name that we give to the functionality that a computer has, right? It's not magic. It's confusing sometimes, right? But it's not magic. So that old argument that Descartes used, it just doesn't work, right? Because I could say, well, look, the atoms of my computer, they only do what atoms do. Physicists can tell us what atoms do, okay? Atoms don't allow me to play World of Warcraft, right? Or go on Facebook or do a conference like this, right? We talk about the software allowing us to do that, right? I got the right kind of software on my computer. I downloaded this software to be able to do these presentations, right? I got the Prezi software going. That software isn't some non-physical thing that can exist by itself. It is just the functionality that arises out of computers, right? Out of the arrangement, the specific configuration of atoms that computers are. So it doesn't do to say, well, software can do different things than atoms, right? Therefore, software is a distinct entity, a distinct substance from atoms, right? Or let's just talk about the hardware and the software, right? Again, I'm going to say what I think you all will agree on, that software is just the functionality of hardware. There's not some other entity that can exist in its own right. Right? Without the physical instantiation, there is no software. Right? So, how are we about computers? We're physicalists about computers, right? We're not dualists. You don't think that hardware can exist in its own right, separate from the software. No, the software is an emergent phenomena that is completely dependent on the hardware of the computer. Right? And we could talk about transferring software, right? I could, for example, I could send you a picture. I'm not going to do that. That sounds creepy and weird, right? But I could send you a picture over the internet. I would have that thing that I sent you. In a way, it's what Descartes was kind of right? The thing that I sent you has no specific shape or location or weight or extension. And yet, it is actually nothing but the underlying hardware that is allowing for me to take that information and send it to you. Right? I could take a file on my phone and delete it. Did my phone suddenly get lighter? No, it did not. It did not get any lighter. But if you follow Descartes' reasoning, he would have you think that it must have, right? Since you got rid of something. If it was something physical that you got rid of, it must now be lighter, right? Of course, it's not something physical that we got rid of, but yet at the same time, it is not like a something that isn't physical that we took away, right? It's tricky to think about this, but I think everyone's okay with software, right? Software doesn't confuse you that much, right? Maybe once you start talking about it, but it's the same sort of thing, right? We've got hardware down here, software up here. There's this relationship between the software and the hardware where if there's no hardware, there's no software. And if there is any software at all, you know there's some sort of hardware that's making it possible. The functionalist says it's the same thing for brain states and mental states. Right? We got our brain states, we got our brain, that's the hardware. We got our mental states, that's the software. We talk about mental states in a different way than we talk about the brain, for example, as a purely physical organ. Right? Because we're talking about it in a different way. We're not talking about its higher level functionalities when we're talking about the hardware level of the brain. When we're talking about the software level, we're talking about all the functionalities that the brain has. Just like when we're talking about the software level of a computer, we're talking about all the functionalities that that hardware has because of the way that it's configured. It's the same thing for mental states, right, according to this view. Your mental states, therefore, are completely dependent on your brain. And there's no way that you can get an immaterial soul on this view. You just can't have a free-floating mind because a mind is software that's implemented on hardware. You could theoretically, of course, you could be immortal, theoretically, right? As long as you could find some way to transfer all that software to some new hardware. As long as you retain all the information, you could conceivably, right, be uploaded onto the internet or something like that, if that's possible, conceivably. Again, it's if you're a functionalist, at least you can't rule that out right away, right? If you're a functionalist, you think that the mind is just a set of very complex abilities that this physical brain has. And so if that's what it is, then perhaps you could implement that same functionality on a different kind of physical system. And it would also mean, right, that if you had a robot that behaved just like us, we would have to say that it has actual mental states. So did anyone ever see Westworld? Westworld was, I think it was on HBO, kind of a fun show. I didn't finish all the seasons. I really liked the first season. Basically, it's like a theme park where you can go, and they make it seem like it's the old Wild Wild West, where it looks like an old town, an old cowboy town, and it's populated with all these people from the Old West, but they're all robots. Right? They've all been programmed within certain parameters. They do have a lot of freedom. If they get the right kind of input, that might trigger a response to go do something totally different from what they were initially programmed. There's all sorts of things like that. They're very complex machines. They're not just these simple robots. No, they're programmed just like us. They have very complex internal states and memories and desires, right? They have certain things they need to do, but how they do that depends on how they've actually interacted with their environment, what they know about their environment, these robots, right? Very complex, to the point that when you are in Westworld, when you're at that theme park, you're not going to be able to tell that these robots aren't humans, right? You can just have conversations with them, hang out with them, spend a long time with them, develop friendships, right? Where there's just no clue for you that these were artificial beings, right? That's how good these robots are in that world. So in that show itself, this question arises: how should you treat these robots? For many people, they go to this Westworld theme park because they want to have no consequences, right? You want to live large and you want to be the biggest, baddest guy, and so you have no contention, you have no problem killing people then, right? You're just this gunslinger, and they're just a bunch of robots. Like that's the appeal of it, right? They're just a bunch of robots. It's all make believe. It's not real. So there's just a bunch of silicone. It doesn't matter. I can just shoot them dead, right? But if you're a functionalist, you can't really say that, can you? If you're a functionalist, if these robots are truly processing reality the same way that you are, then they have internal mental states, and they're capable of actual suffering, right? And so that means that where if you're normally a moral person who cares about the consequences of your actions, and who cares about how you treat people. I'm going to assume everyone's like that. Not everybody's like that, but I'm going to assume that you're all like that. That you understand why it's wrong to just kill a person in the street, right? Yeah, it's wrong because it causes suffering. You don't have the right to take someone else's life. It causes suffering for the people that know that person. Right? It creates fear in the general public. There's also all sorts of bad things about it, but mostly it's the fact that we think no one has the right to take the life of an innocent person, or even harm them or make them suffer for no good reason. But if it's a robot, and it functions just like we do, then, if we notice that when we punch it in the face, it goes, ow, why did you do that? You'd have to start treating the robot as a moral being, right? As someone who's worthy of moral respect, that we need to think about their point of view and their feelings and the way that we deal with them, that we cannot treat them simply like we treat robots now, right? We just use them as a means towards an end, right? There's nothing intrinsically moral or anything like that about a Roomba, right? You don't worry if you kick a Roomba. Everyone knows what a Roomba is, right? Those little robots that clean your floor all by themselves. Notice they're little functional units as well, right? They're taking input from the environment. They have a very specific set of rules, what they're supposed to do based on those inputs. But of course, no Roomba behaves in exactly the same way because they're in different spaces, all that stuff. But you're not worried about a Roomba because it does not have all the functionalities that humans do. But if you had a robot that behaved just like humans do, you'd have all the same functionalities. And so it would follow that you would have to treat it as a moral being, as long as you thought you should treat human beings in general in a moral way, right? So it's kind of a test. It's kind of a test of how you think about all this, right? Ask yourself, is that true? Right? What do you think about the Westworld robots? Do you have a moral obligation to treat them fairly and honestly the way you do with normal humans? Or are they just playthings and you don't have to worry about that at all? Maybe you have to worry about some of your consequences for other reasons, but not because you're putting yourself in their shoes or you're having empathy or anything like that. There might be other reasons for it, but I'm saying, should you feel some sort of empathy towards these beings? Should you care about what happens to them because you realize that they're just like you? Or do you say, no, it's just a hunk of metal. How can that have any feelings? So what are your thoughts? Let's end it on that. Does anyone have, what are your intuitions? What do you feel yourself leaning towards, even if you don't totally know or have strong opinions about it? But would these Westworld robots, should they be treated as sentient beings and therefore beings that we have moral responsibility towards, or not? What do you think? Yeah. Yeah, it's hard, right? There's still something very difficult, for me at least. I have the same intuition. I think I would want to be the kind of person, I think I would choose to be the kind of person that would treat them morally, okay? But at the same time, when I try to imagine that such a being could feel pain, real pain the way you do, that gets to be more difficult, right? Because then I start just thinking about all the wiring, right? Yeah, we kind of feel like a sentient being has to be organic, and this is why some people say that this is nothing more than a prejudice that human beings have, right? So some functionalists will say that it's just a prejudice that we have as human beings, right? That we are sort of carbon-centric, right? That we imagine that something can only be sentient if it's made of the right kind of organic material, right? And that's going back to that identity theory way of thinking, right? That what matters is what you're made of. Yeah. But the functionalist might say, no, that's just a prejudice you have. If you had, let's say tomorrow we found out that, in fact, we somehow hadn't noticed, but in fact, aliens planted a bunch of robots here on Earth, and about half the people are actually robots. Now, if this is news to you, you might have a hard time reconciling that. But suppose that this was just part of reality. You realize, oh yeah, some of my friends are made of carbon, some of my friends are made of, some other silicone. Right? You joke with them the same way. You give each other crap, right? Just imagine any old friendship or any relationship that you have with anyone. But then somebody tells you, well, they're made out of silicone. If you were just used to that, you would say, so what? But because we're not used to it, right, you start making fun of them, right? Yeah, you can imagine having that kind of prejudice. But really, you'd have to end up saying that it's just because they're made of different stuff. Even though they're reacting the same way to things as other human beings are. Of course, they're each going to be their unique person because they will each have their unique hardware. Sometimes people get the wrong idea and they think that if humans are like robots, then that would mean that all humans would react like that. No, that's not what we're saying, right? We're saying a human would be a very complex kind of robot And it would be the kind of robot where, you know, what would it take for a robot to be like us? Well, for one, they'd have to actually have a history, right, to be able to relate to them as a human being. So we might have to imagine that robots actually have to go through the stages of development like we do, right? And to make them individuals, they would have to have individual life experiences, right? So this robot has this kind of life, that robot has this kind of life. They're going to be different kinds of robots because they have different knowledge base, different beliefs that they have to work on. We can already do this, right? There are self-learning robots. This is the future of AI, is robots that can actually learn from their environment. So they don't have to be programmed. They don't have to be pre-programmed with everything in there. They just have to be programmed with the basics, right? The same way human beings are programmed with certain basic elements when we're born, but then we take that, you know, it's those Kantian kind of things that we now know are structures in the brain. But our individual experiences allow us to see the world in different ways, depending on what kind of background we have. And robots would be the same kind of thing, right? They wouldn't all be the same because they would have different life experiences. You know, where was I going with that? Yeah, well, so basically, it's a good way to test your intuitions. So I kind of hate to say it, but I'd find myself intuitively kind of having that prejudice. I kind of think that, how could they really have pain? But then I think, you know, how is it different for a human being, right? And this is where sometimes someone might then want to go back to dualism. And they might say, well, yeah, that's the exact same problem. How can you get pain out of just a configuration of atoms? That's all I am, is it's just a particular configuration of atoms. How can I have this physical sensation from the inside of pain that you can't have? You don't feel my pain, right? You can see all my atoms for all you care. You could do a brain scan and see everything that's going on, but you don't feel my pain. So is that pain really physically instantiated in that system then, or not, right? And you might say, well, no physical system is able to produce the subjective experience, the conscious experience of a pain or the smell of coffee or something like that. It's just not possible. That's what the dualist would want to say. Yeah. So it's just a way for you to test your intuitions, right? Yeah. So a series of questions, really. Are human beings basically a type of robot where, you know, we're composed of a bunch of atoms. We're a physical machine that has these emergent functionalities that we call mental states? Is that what we're like? Then second question, if that's what we're like, then why wouldn't a robot with the same kind of functionalities count as a person as well? Or if you think no, right, a purely physical system could never produce these subjective inner states. It has to be something else. Then you think, well, then what is it? Something else. Maybe we're back to dualism. Yeah. Okay, let's stop there. Unless you had any questions or comments or anything you wanted to add to this. But basically, your homework is to think about this. How do you see yourself? Right? I don't think anyone wants to stay with pure mind-brain identity theory because it's too problematic. It's probably going to be a choice between this kind of physical functionalism or something like dualism, right, so far. We haven't looked at panpsychism, really. I talked about it a little bit. But so far, these are sort of what's on the table for a traditional view, sort of a traditional, almost common sense, but kind of not anymore. The past 100 years or so have really changed the face of humanity. The past 500 years as well. So at some point in the past, for someone like Descartes, it was almost just like obvious that, of course, we have an immortal soul, right, that gets to go to God. Now, how can I bolster that? How can I make that philosophically respectable, right? That's what Descartes was doing, these arguments for dualism. But those are your basic choices, right? That you are essentially this immaterial soul that can exist apart from your body and your brain, right? That you are like software that can exist without any kind of hardware. Or you take the view that your mind is like software and your brain is like the hardware. Right? Those are your two basic choices so far. Right? And so what are your intuitions about it, right? Think about this stuff. I'm sure everyone's already thought about this to some extent, but this is one of those things where it's not just academic philosophy, just talking. It's how do you see yourself? What kind of being are you, right? Uh, at the very least, human beings are able to reflect on their position in life, right? We're able to see ourselves from the outside, as it were. And so, for as a human being to be able to do that, but then to never actually question anything would be at least from my point of view, it's kind of a waste, right? So you want to ask yourself these questions while you're here on Earth walking around, right? How does this work? What kind of being are you? Right? And so my aim is not to convince you of any of these specific ones. I just want to give you a range of options for you to look at and for you to think about. Okay, be done there. Oh, next time we'll look at a few objections to physicalism. I already voiced some of them. Just the basic idea that's a mere configuration of atoms. How could that possibly give rise to the inner subjective feeling of a pain, right? How is that possible? Or how can a configuration of atoms have their heart broken, right? Romantically, I mean, right? How's that possible to feel that despair in the inside? How can a bunch of atoms do that, right? That's kind of a main objection. So we'll look at that more next time. And then we'll move on to, I believe it's free will, which is fun too. Okay.
Tim, are you going to do a logic class next semester?
Let's see. No, next semester I have 2 intros and 1 philosophy of religion. I have a philosophy of religion.
I'm on right now looking at it. I don't see it. I see it looks like Savage and Johnston are doing the logic.
Right, yeah. And I've never done logic at CR. I've only done critical thinking, where we do logic as part of it, but it's not the whole time. So I'd love to get logic sometime. It just sort of depends on who gets assigned what. So next semester...
Would you recommend Savage or Johnson? Either one of those, or both?
I don't know Savage. Johnson, yeah. I just don't know Savage, but I've interacted with Johnson a little bit. I've seen sort of some of what he does, and he's a very, very likable, nice person. I know that. He's someone you get along with easily, I think. Yeah, he's a pleasant personality.
I think I need all the help on logic I can get, especially when I take the LSAT. So I don't really need this class. But if I take the other classes, I might as well. Maybe this couldn't hurt, right?
What's that?
It couldn't hurt.
No, totally. No, it's great to do. Yeah, no, if you could take a logic class, especially if you are looking at taking those kinds of tests, that's going to be very helpful, I think. Yeah.
All right, cool. Yeah, I was hoping you were on there, but yeah, it's like I said. Oh, okay. Well, very cool. So yeah, I'll what you said about Johnson probably, it's better than not doing anything.
Right, exactly. So I don't know what your overall experience will be or what it would have been. All I know is from my personal interaction with Johnson, he seems like a pleasant person, right? I mean, I could describe someone in a positive way without saying that they have that they are likable. But in his case, I always see he seems like a laid back, affable kind of person.
But that means a lot,
Yeah.
I mean, it does makes it a little bit easier. So
right.
At this point, I just don't want to be stuck like we were talking about earlier. It's most important that the class there's involvement and interaction.
Yeah.
I've seen the other side, and it's a tough hill to climb
right.
without any sort of guidance, and that's more important to me than I think.
Right, because why wouldn't we have just done it that way all along then, if we didn't really need the instructor except for just to organize everything, right? What's the point? Yeah.
I mean, even random like the great courses or anything, you're still involved, even though there's no grading or anything like that. You're still watching videos that help guide you.
Right.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, it was something that you said, about Good Will Hunting. All you need is a library card, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's
like, yeah, you could do that, but
you have to be a special type of person, right?
Yeah. And most people looking for an education, you get into this because you get that extra help from an instructor who's, yeah, exactly. But I do think this whole COVID thing took everyone by surprise. And I think I mentioned this. I got an email from CR Now, I still don't know how much they meant this, but it seemed to be indicating that people don't want to have to show up for these kinds of meetings. And so I took that and I said, okay, well, fine, then I'm not going to make it required. I'll respect that. I'll make sure nobody requires it. But I think maybe a lot of instructors just thought, well, okay, if they don't want that part, then I just won't do it. So
Yeah, maybe they meant like the ability to show up at a certain time.
Right.
Do it. I 20 years ago when I took online classes or whatever, like one of them I remember I took some in Hawaii and I had to go to a satellite center.
Oh wow, right.
And they had the camera set up and all that.
Oh,
stuff.
interesting.
And you interacted and with the class in Hilo, even though I was on the other side of the island.
Right.
And that was before the technology had caught up to be able to do what we're doing today.
Right. Yeah.
And, I still think, yeah, again, like maybe that's how they took it. I think also it's other people have other jobs.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's also it.
Right.
And I think for a lot of the maybe they haven't even taught these classes online because they were never offered online.
Right. Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I've never done this online. It just happens to be that I like using Canvas for a lot of the grading, and I've made these presentations in the past, so I was sort of like ready to go to go online.
Right.
Yeah. Most of my system was already on there, even though I hadn't done it purely online. So much of it was already implemented there.
Yeah, it's like my nutrition teacher was SoftChalk. I don't know if you're familiar with SoftChalk.
Oh yeah.
It's another program, and it's the same thing. You can tell she loves doing it and knows exactly how to use it. So
right.
She was in Tahoe, and so she's been doing it obviously for a while, teaching at CR from Tahoe.
Oh right, okay, yeah.
Her comfort level with SoftChalk is awesome. It's like you with the crises. You can tell you have a fundamental understanding of how to use the system.
Right.
My other teacher, he could be a 65-year-old dude who literally doesn't use computers on an everyday basis, so why wouldn't you have that?
Right.
Class in Canvas. To him, it's like you're
too overwhelming.
So far in his comfort zone that maybe it's not something that you can do. But
I think that's right.
Option, and it's like I would have had to move back up to Humboldt and make up some of these classes I failed 22 years ago.
Right.
To technically get them off my record.
Right.
I can make them up here, but it's not going to be the same, right?
Right.
So
totally.
The other option was to move back to Humboldt for 6 months and do it this way. And who can in reality do that?
Mm-hmm.
Very few people.
Right.
So for me, it's a blessing that I can make up this nutrition class that I took for all the wrong reasons 22 years ago.
Right.
So
that is pretty cool that you can just do that.
Yeah, it's so but now it's like I should be in the nursing program and take it and all this stuff. And I assume with the Native American history class I'm taking, there's no way that they would ever offer it if it wasn't for COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, to be able to clean up my mess, this is the only way that works. But I'm just hitting some major speed bumps or walls, if you will.
Right.
For some of these teachers that aren't, I feel, giving as much as you are.
You're right.
My other teachers are.
Right.
And who knows? Like that's it's just I feel it's a little bit unfair I'm doing okay, but there's other people that maybe aren't because they need some sort of interaction.
Right. Well, yeah, that's too bad about that. It's encouraging for me to have you say that because, as you can see, typically 3 or 4 or 5 people show up, but it's encouraging to me to think that maybe it's good for a lot of people anyway. They might be checking this out later. It's good to know that the effort is worth it.
Yeah, this class would be pretty tough if you didn't come to these lectures.
Right, I know. Yeah.
The way that you test and everything, it's not overly hard, I would say, but you need, if you're not listening to what you have to say and the way you kind of bring it around,
right.
I don't even know if I could even, the test would be like, what?
Yeah, right. Yeah, because the test is very much geared around what I think is important, what I want to show you. So if you're just looking at the book or just doing the videos, you're going to cover everything, but it's not going to be as zeroed in on all the things that are going to be on the test. Whereas if you show up for this and at least watch the videos, I'm mostly just testing stuff that I talk about in class. So yeah, you're right.
Yeah, well, I wish more people would be on. I don't know if I'm still the only guy that gives you the video feed, but
yeah,
you asked for it, so I give it to you because I know it makes your life a little bit easier, and at least you see another human. But
yes, exactly.
When I went back and watched the video, and I'm just sitting there like, oh my god, because I missed part of one video, and I'm like, oh my God, these guys can see me too. I'm the only guy there, and I'm back here. My dogs are doing God knows what. But you know what? Like I said, I respect you enough, and you asked to have somebody on the video, so I'm gonna.
Well, I appreciate it. And again, you don't have to do it if there's privacy issues, but I do appreciate it. It is always nice to see somebody that it's yeah, that's
you
good.
asked for it, and I will. That's an
Appreciate it. Appreciate it.
Do it for me.
Thank you.
It's
Yeah.
funny that no one else does it. Oh my God.
I know. I was surprised. Yeah. Or so.
For you, buddy.
All right, man. Thank you.
You can look at my mug any day. There you go. So,
Cool.
all right.
All right.
I'll see you next week, and I'm gonna go back and watch Tuesday's video. And if I have any questions, I'll get a hold
Let
of
me
you.
know.
And, you know, hopefully do okay in the midterm. That's about it. So,
Yep. Yeah. We'll do a little review next week as well. So.
It's gonna be interesting on Tuesday. Try to keep anyone's attention on Tuesday during class.
Oh, I know, right? I know. I know. If anyone shows up,
I
even
don't know.
we'll see.
Well, hopefully they all voted, man. That's all.
Yeah.
Hopefully they got out there and did their thing. Because I know when I was 19 or 20, it was hard to care, man.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so hard to think.
All right. Thank you. Have a good weekend, everyone. Bye.
Yep.